Good afternoon.
That is loud. Okay.
Good afternoon and welcome. Thank you for joining us. We are going to talk about something that is affecting most businesses today, which is generational skill gaps. So first thing I'll say is we're not going to sell you on a product. What we want to do is some analysis, and then we're going to walk you through a strategy for how to address some of these issues. So we decided that since we're talking about multi-generational skill gaps, that we would enforce stereotypes and go in order of age. So they put me first. So I'm Charles, I'm the head of product. We've got Shawn Burson, our head of learning design here, and then we have Steve Smedes, our head of customer success. So if any of you read the synopsis or just guessing what this is about, we are talking about multi-generational skill gaps. So I want to introduce the problem here and maybe survey you to see if any of you have experience with this. So what we want to get into is what we see as essentially a neglect for workers who have been in the workforce longer. So this is maybe something that you're familiar with, that you see in your own workplace. Over the last few years, there has been a heavy focus on addressing the millennial skill gap. You've probably been to a lot of presentations about how worried we are about millennials and what they're going to do to the workforce, and how to better train them, how to better prepare for the realities of today. However, there's a bigger problem that is now emerging, which is that we've created skill gaps across generations. So if you look at age as sort of a spectrum, you have the skill gap at the beginning of the spectrum with Generation Z and with millennials. But as technologies have changed the way that we work, a skill gap has emerged for laborers who are in the workforce longer. This can be very difficult for businesses to address because it is a totally new problem for them. How do you keep your workforce up to speed? How do you upskill your workers? How do you keep training and education relevant? So the first thing to look at is that over 2/3 of workers surveyed agree it's important to continuously update their workplace skills. I think that's probably why we're all here. We want to learn how to better keep our workforce prepared and trained. It's a fairly obvious thing. However, what's really disappointing about this number is less than half of those surveyed actually feel like the businesses they work for have addressed this for them and have given them the ability to have skills that will prepare them for the future. So they are feeling completely unprepared. The other thing here is that 1/3 of all workers here in Great Britain, almost half over 55, say they feel they did not learn anything new in the workplace last year. That's an incredible problem because you're applying new technologies in the workplace, the nature of work is changing, but the people who have the most experience feel the least prepared. So what does this mean and how do we actually address this? Well, what we want to talk about is how we change perception around generational training and how we change perception around skill gaps across these generations. We are now in a labor force that represents the largest generational span ever in modern history, and challenges that are emerging are unlike anything we've ever seen. So first, there's the biological reality and the economic reality that workers are staying in the workforce longer. If you're in your 20s right now, researchers estimate that you have a 50% chance of living to 100 years old, which is unprecedented. What that also means is that you have to sustain yourself. You have to sustain your lifestyle, your family, right? And so most of us are finding that we cannot retire at ages expected by earlier generations. This means you need to keep your skills current in the workforce, which is becoming more and more of a challenge as you remain in the workforce longer. In the United States alone, it's estimated that less than 50% of the population will be able to sustain their current way of life after retirement. So what they have come to expect in terms of living will be completely changed by the time they retire, if they retire. The other part of this is the competitive reality. So most skill sets in the workforce last less than 24 months. They have a half-life of less than 2 years. So these are two diametrically opposed forces in terms of skill development and upskilling. So you're staying in the workforce longer, but your skills are less applicable or are applicable for a shorter amount of time than ever before. So how do you actually align these two different forces? And then there's the economic reality of it. So despite the fact that there was a global recession almost 10 years ago, there's a scarcity of skilled workers, right? So you have fewer and fewer people being able to do the jobs we need them to do, and we've been so focused on training millennials, we've been so focused on preparing younger generations that in fact existing resources, existing workers have been neglected. These are the people, again, with the most experience who can bring their values and are willing to work, but are not being trained. They are not being upskilled. So I'm going to hand this over to Steve Smedes, and he's going to talk us through the demographics, the actual composition of the different generations, and where they are on the spectrum. And then Shawn is going to present strategies for how to address these gaps.
Thank you, Charlie. And excuse my voice today. We've been talking quite a bit, so I may be going through a little bit of puberty myself. So just bear with me if we crack a bit. So let's talk a bit about the newest generation, Gen Z. These are the folks that are about to start entering the workforce. The oldest of them are coming up at 21, 22 years of age. And they're predicting about 60 million of these workers are going to be entering the workforce over the next couple of years. They are coming like a freight train. And one of the most interesting things is they think about work very differently than some of the older generation. And they're not afraid to talk about it. If you don't actually address their needs and deliver what they're looking for in a work experience, they have a lot of options for them out there. Unemployment is low. They're likely to jump and look for other opportunities that give them what they're looking for out of their workplace. So what are they actually looking for from work? And it's always very interesting when you actually survey the different age ranges. In the older generations, again and again, the top couple things that they're looking for, paycheck and benefits. It's almost exactly switched when you talk about the younger generations like Gen Z, because they are much more concerned with work-life balance and personal and professional career development. And that kind of goes along with something you often hear out there is it's a switch from having material possessions to life experience is what the younger generation values as currency. So they really value job security. They're actually motivated by benefits that really enhance their lives. It's actually going to give them a step up in where they want to go in life. That's not necessarily job security at one company, but I want security that I'm learning and growing as a person, both as a person and in my career. So that's something that is very important to them. They also need a sense of purpose. It's not just collecting a paycheck week over week. They actually want to know why they're there and they're actually helping to improve the world. They need to feel like they're a vital part of the organization. And if they don't, if they feel they're undervalued, they may leave. Good example of this is in hiring practices. The traditional hiring practices may not work for Gen Z when you just say, this is your job description. Maybe instead explain to them what value you're bringing to the organization over 1 month, over 6 months, over years, so they really understand how they're contributing and being a part of it. They really don't want to be just a cog in the wheel. And if you've ever worked with any of this, then it's always interesting about the third day on the job, they're actually ready to start climbing the career ladder and looking at promotional opportunities. They're like, it's day 3, we're just getting started. But they are very hungry for this in their professions. They also really prefer mobile-first learning. These are the first truly digital natives. They grew up with cell phones. Most of them had an iPhone by age 10. And anything that is outside of the mobile experience is just completely foreign to them. They really are connected. Their smartphones are an extension of themselves. And the averages say they spend about 5 hours a day online. So you really need to reach them in the way they know to work. Some of your old traditional training methods, instructor-led training, PDFs, flat text, is just not going to capture the attention of Gen Z and the way they like to learn. They like to go to YouTube, they like to go to Reddit, they like to go to Quora, they like to talk to a louder crowd of their community and find out the answers for themselves in very modern methodologies. So there's a lot of differences in the way these folks think that you need to accommodate as a business to make sure you're going to keep them engaged and keep them productive. So now let's take a look about the other side of the spectrum, baby boomers. And by the way, we're not leaving out the Gen Zs and millennials. We know everybody is here and that you're not slackers, but you guys are going to have a different set of challenges when you hit 50 and 60. So we're kind of thinking, let's cross that bridge when you get there and talk about the baby boomers for a minute. And what's really interesting is we want to bust up some of the myths of baby boomers. There's a lot of things like they're kind of old, set in their ways, they don't want to change, they just want to repeat the same thing. But when you really get into the research, you find out that's not true. There's really no shift whatsoever in the level of challenge they are willing to accept to learn new things, no matter what your age is. They are willing to learn, they do want to pick up new concepts. One of the big differences, though, is they want to move towards more self-selected and directed. The big thing for an older crowd is they know what they don't know. What they don't want to do is repeat everything they've already been taught for decades and sit through training they've already experienced. But they do have a great idea of what they actually need to know to improve their job. So they want to direct themselves, find that learning they don't know, and they want to know how to capture it. And it's also a shift towards personal experience and driven. They have been for decades been the expert-driven training led by an instructor in the crowd, and they want to move to an experience where they're actually finding this knowledge for themselves. They know their experience is an asset. They want to share that. The worst thing for an older generation is, I know all this stuff. I've learned all this experience. I want to share it with my company. How can I get that knowledge out to them? But they are also very open to learning new things and taking in knowledge from others. They want to learn new methods, new technologies, new techniques that are coming up in the world. So they want to share out, but they also want to take new knowledge in. So, and to actually bring us up to the next question is, the question that comes up then is, how can you use these new training methods to retrain these type of experienced workers? Pass that over to Shawn.
Thank you. So an important question to ask is live. Can you hear me? Yeah. Important question to ask, obviously, before you go full force into creating training that is targeted at a specific demographic like baby boomers, is a responsible question of, can experienced workers actually be trained? I have a quote here to start off that speaks to that Josh Burson from a Reuters article said, "We spent a lot of time with human resource departments around the world, and they're starting to realize that one of the best talent pools that they can recruit from are people that they already have." So how is this validated? Well, the good news is that science confirms that you actually can teach old dogs new tricks. In fact, as the graphic is showing, neuroplasticity describes the way that the brain continually can create new neural pathways and connections. So that's good news. You can actually continue to learn as you mature. So taking that into consideration, this actually makes baby boomers an underused organizational resource, in the sense that if you consider the fact that I have a skill gap that I'm trying to address, you have two options. You can either retrain or uptrain from within, or I can hire from the outside. And if I have a worker who's been with a company for a longer period of time, they have 85% of the training that's necessary that you need to upskill another 15, versus bringing someone in from the outside that specifically has that 15%, and now I need to go back through and train them on all the rest of the 85%, organizational, procedural, anything like that in the corporation. That takes time, that takes money, that takes resources. So they are an untapped resource within an organization. Another quote that I actually liked was from Chip Conley from his book, Wisdom at Work. And really it speaks to the fact that where an aging workforce, once again, stereotypically can be seen as a liability, if you have buy-in to actually convert the baby boomer crowd from being the wisdom keepers, or the sages that sit in the back room and they're an information store, but they're not really part of the learning process, and converting them over to be some of the wisdom seekers of the future, right alongside all the other demographics in an organization. They are learning participants. So that sounds great in theory. One of the things that I did was I wanted to make sure that we had a live use case for this. So AT&T, a tiny telecommunications company, they in 2016, they had a real problem that they needed to address within their company. And that was the fact that for a company who was used to, for the past decade, being on the forefront of technology, they saw coming down the tracks a whole new computing area that their technology and their assets and their infrastructure was not going to be able to compete with. So it wasn't just a hardware software issue, they actually found that they had a need, they had skills gaps, they actually had employment gaps that emerged in bringing in and instituting cloud computing. They had coders that they did not have to previously employ. They also had things like data science that they had to source for. So they chose, starting in 2013, to invest $250 million on employee education and professional development, as well as to offer $30 million in assistance for continued education to try and tap into that resource and upskill the resources that they already had. So the results in that, they estimated that they had 140,000 employees that were actively engaged in acquiring new knowledge from within their organization. So between January and May of 2016, the tangible results were that half of all the tech management jobs that were being filled were actually from employees that were being retrained or uptrained within the organization, as well as almost half of all the promotions were being given to current employees. So validation of the fact that you can take a workforce throw them into what is somewhat foreign market and actually uptrain from within. So now we get down to some of the questions that were posed in the description for this seminar. We know that there are differences between the age groups. We know that there are potential training methods that could work, but we need to ask ourselves or decide for ourselves whether it's possible to actually create training that speaks to the 20-year-olds and the 60-year-olds alike, and the Gen X's and the Millennials. We're not discounting any of that. For the sake of time, we're sticking between very specific time, or between two different age ranges. We found a report that basically they went out and canvassed 450 individuals that were between age ranges of 20 and 60 by 10-year increments. So while a lot of the priorities clearly are shifting between, and they asked them specifically what their training preferences and their learning preferences was. Obviously, you're going to get variations in priorities, but the interesting part was that 3 different preferences emerged that were common across 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. The first one was active learning. And if you look at this from the perspective of both the baby boomer and Gen Y as that two ends of the spectrum, from a baby boomer perspective, like Steve mentioned, they've experienced an old training methodology. They've been flown out for a 3-day training session where you sit in a room and you're lectured to. That's not something that they want to do again. They value their place in the workplace. They also value the ability to learn and be trained in different ways. So they want to experience something new. They know they're going to be in the workforce longer. They don't want to be a part of the same stagnant learning plan. In contrast, with the younger generation, education has changed, training has already started to change, so they may not know any different than an active, engaging strategy. And so that's what they tend to expect. They also valued a challenging learning preference or training preference. Once again, from the baby boomer perspective, that sense of purpose, that they want to be valuable. They don't want to just be spoken to in a training. They want to be part of it. They want to be challenged. They want to make progress. But also from the other end of the spectrum, there's a lot of things factoring into this, including even simple things like exposure to video games. One of the things that's very interesting in adult learning theory, that you can take a cue from things like video games. As an instructional designer, we always want to explain things up front, and I'm going to give you an objective, and I'm going to give you learning outcomes, and I'm going to explain everything too. In something like a video game, they drop you into a situation, and you have to figure out what to do next. And this is something that they're used to, younger generations, because of the amount of time that they spend in games and things like that. They're expecting to have to figure things out from the get-go, not have it specifically told to them up front. And the third one is actually being self-directed, and we touched on this before in the baby boomer and in the Gen Z area, and that is really just 2 expectations. One saying, look, I know what I know and I know what I don't know, and I should be able to pick and choose and find the interest points and find the things that I know I need to be trained on, from the other end of the spectrum, once again, they're used to having things at their fingertips and having resources out there, and they always have. We recently bought my wife a convertible, and we couldn't figure out how to open the actual hood, and we found the answer recorded by an 11-year-old on YouTube. So just an example of things that came to an 11-year-old's mind to record videos on how to work his father's car. It's just ingrained in them. Obviously, we know that it's never going to be a one-size-fits-all situation. But the good news is that what this found was there are commonalities between all of these different age ranges that you can take advantage of. A couple other things that really are sort of spawned from the baby boomer range is that everyone recognizes, or everyone appreciates recognition, and that is universal. It's not just a single age range. They can be appreciated for the value that they have to the company. Being able to engineer greater choice in the learning experience. Once again, we've already discussed several times, people expect to be able to pick and choose. They need a bigger variety. They don't want to be in a dark room just watching a video or having someone lecture to them from a PowerPoint, ironically. And then drawing upon experiences. And once again, that's from two different perspectives. You have resources based on their maturity, their level of experience, their time invested in a company where they're going to be natural fits to be someone that's seen as a source of knowledge. But as Steve mentioned, with that younger crowd, they're looking for ways to be valuable. So even in the infancy, as they're inserted into a workforce, anything that they know or that they learn that they can bring to the table, they also want to be part of that learning experience to actually be a source of knowledge rather than just be someone who is learning. So putting this all into practice where the rubber meets the road, what would this actually look like if you were to institute something that sort of bridges the gaps between all these age ranges and covers millennials and Gen X? Maybe a couple different higher level types of things that'll fill this. Point of need is age agnostic. The age barriers tend to disappear if you set up an environment where the actual learners can search for, find, and access training that they think is important to them. And that is regardless of age range, demographic, you're going to have a deeper buy-in, and no one is going to feel like they're being separated by demographic if you give them an environment where they can search out and seek knowledge that they want to acquire. I have an example here, which is quick. An example of this is in the difference of choice of placing training courses into something like an LXP. LearnAmp, for example, they do a great job of creating an environment that fosters community, it fosters engagement, curiosity, so that if you can create a sense that you have a place to go for learning that is not only when it's dictated to you, but you can find learning resources of your own that you have actually selected, curated yourself. It's one way to get immediate buy-in, and that does not apply to a single demographic. Second way is, like Steve mentioned also, that if you have previously or traditionally instructor-led type of material, reframing that so it can be more digestible, missing an L and an E, self-paced and interactive. So if we revisit those types of points, active, this can be the difference in the actual level of engagement in terms of participation in the actual courseware, whether it is through the use of interactives, where a learner is actually physically, tangibly, tactile, needing to participate in a course. But you also can take it a step back and say, especially what speaks to the baby boomer age, is that they like to be included in the planning. So you can create an active versus a passive learning experience by having them involved in the planning, the execution, as well as the evaluation of the training after it's been given. So using them as a valuable resource in that. Challenging, for all the same reasons, as we said before, creating something that creates an action first. Pose a question. Include an activity as the first thing that someone is encountering in a learning module, but give them something to do, and that, for 2 different reasons across those age groups, gets them engaged from the very beginning. Self-direction was the third preference, and this can once again be instituted in a couple different ways. If you're speaking strictly about the ability just to navigate a course, so even inside of a prescribed course, you can create a level of self-direction by doing something as simple as creating or providing a table of contents, and allowing them to actually seek out the points in the order that they feel like they need to access it, rather than a strictly linear, I am being held hostage to the order in which this information is being given. And that is, once again, something that both of those age groups are looking for. And then it comes down to, even inside of a course and inside of a lesson, the interactivity, rather than having something that is just information flying by, creating self-paced type of learning where they can control the flow of information. That's our slides. So start a little, if there are any questions that we can answer for the last few minutes. Yes? Traditionally, not that the question was, do you see a difference between UK and United States training? Personally, I don't see a difference between it. I don't know if Charlie, Steve, you have any experience that would contradict that, but I think effective learning can and should be effective learning. Doesn't matter what the geographic region is.
One thing you can do is take a look at your different learning personas and divide your audience up and kind of get a great idea of what their specific needs are. And sometimes there could be regional differences between your learner communities, and that could really go into your design. You think about those learning personas. You have a US student and a UK student. What are their different needs? What is their prior knowledge? What may be the technical or regional gaps? What language may not come across in both of those? So if you keep those learning personas in mind as you're designing your training, you can account for those kind of differences as you go through it. And it's a variety. Sometimes one size fits all. Sometimes you need really bespoke content depending on regions. And it just really depends on what you're training and how you break up your community.
It's true. Socioeconomic factors. If we're talking about globally, there can be, it's mainly triggered from lack of resources or lack of access to resources, that you can have geographically a workforce that has not had educational or workplace opportunities that other places have. All right, thank you guys very much.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you.
If you haven't stopped by, we're at stand E65. We'd love you all to come by, get a demo, grab a t-shirt or two, some candy, some laptop stickers.
And we have beer in a couple
hours.
Beer,
yes. Beer, maybe most importantly. Thank you guys.